Welcome to the ECG Management Consultants and Foley and Lardner Pediatric Business and Healthcare Delivery Series. Our topic is titled Pediatric Research Using Inquiry to Enhance Your Hospital's Success. This final session in our 5-part series will discuss the role that research can play in your hospital and what you need to know to maximize success. Our speakers will share information on research program development strategies, protecting intellectual property, and the current funding environment. We'll be exploring a number of topics, including the benefits of a research program, the research funding environment, maximizing your research potential, and specific issues related to startup companies based on intellectual property developed in academic medical centers. Hello, I'm Ken Rorda. I'm a principal with ECG and leader of our firm's children's healthcare practice. I'm pleased to be your co-host along with Mark Waxman from the law firm of Foley and Lardner, and as well as the moderator for today's webinar. Before I introduce today's speakers, let's go over a few details about the webinar. It's 90 minutes in length. The first 70 minutes of the program is a presentation, followed by a 20-minute question and answer session. We have emailed all participants a copy of the slides that will be shown throughout this webinar. Note that attendees are participating in listen-only mode, but if you have questions, you can type them into the question and answer pane that's located in the toolbar on the right of your screen, and you can do that at any time. At the end of the formal presentation, our speakers will answer as many of your questions as possible. We will also be polling the audience a few times during the webinar, and we hope you will participate by simply clicking on your response to the question that appears on screen. Finally, upon exiting today's program, you will be directed to an electronic survey. Your feedback is important to us, especially as we think about 2013 planning, so please take a minute or two to complete this survey. So without further delay, let's meet our speakers. We're pleased to have 3 presenters joining us today. Our first speaker is my colleague, Patty Adams. Patty is a senior manager within ECG's children's healthcare practice. She has experience with strategic and business planning, research administration, physician compensation, and billing and clinic operations. She previously worked at the University of Washington School of Medicine as department administrator for obstetrics and gynecology and as director of finance and administration for the Department of Pediatrics, as well as director for clinical planning and implementation within the dean's office. During her time there, she opened and managed a multi-specialty clinic, developed protocols for research programs, created funds flow models and faculty incentive plans, collaborated with hospital leaders on work expectations, FTE levels, and financial support for physician roles, and established robust reporting for productivity expectations in annual budgets. Quite a mouthful. Welcome, Patty.
Thank you, Ken.
Next, Jim Hendricks is president of Seattle Children's Research Institute. In this capacity, he is responsible for promoting, regulating, and administering the institute to foster its growth and development. Jim is also an assistant dean for research at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Downtown Seattle Association and the Washington Biotechnology and Medical Technology Association. Dr. Hendricks earned his PhD in pathology and laboratory medicine from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Ken.
We are also pleased to have with us today Diane McCarthy. Diane serves as Chief Counsel for Research Affairs at Boston Children's Hospital. She previously served as Deputy General Counsel for Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary, a Harvard-affiliated institution focusing on clinical care and research, and General Counsel for Joslin Diabetes Center, Inc., and the Joslin Clinic, Inc., a Harvard-affiliated research and clinical institute, or institutes, focusing on the treatment and cure of diabetes. Prior to Joslin, she was Associate General Counsel at Care Group, Inc., a hospital physician network in eastern Massachusetts, which includes Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, New England Baptist Hospital, and other community hospitals. Prior to joining Care Group, she was an associate in the business department of Nutter, McLennan, and Fish, LLP, and a member of the firm's healthcare practice group. She has over 20 years of experience in the healthcare field as both a clinical social worker and a healthcare administrator. Welcome, Diane.
Thanks, Ken.
So at this point, I'd like to review our agenda briefly. As I mentioned before, our specific topics today that we will cover include benefits of a research program, research funding environment, maximizing your research potential, and issues related to startup companies based on intellectual property developed in AMCs. And so at this point, I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker, Patty Adams, to begin the formal part of the presentation. Patty?
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to talk a little bit about benefits of a research program. And I think it's interesting to talk about this because most of us who are working in children's health care and in hospital programs realize that most of the community and the people that we interact with on a daily basis think of us as a provider of clinical care. And it's not always apparent that there's a lot of research going on in our institutions. And sometimes if you talk about this, people will ask, why would I have a research program? So I wanted to go over some of the benefits that are achieved through a research program and help present some of this, give you some ideas about how to reach out to your community when you think of this. On slide number 7, what you might see is, I'm sorry, I would like to go back to slide number 5. Slide number 5, we were talking a bit about the enhanced patient care. And what you see here is that the clinical research programs provide unique patient care protocols not available in other settings. And I think the key thing here is that as I went out and did a little web research, if you look at a lot of children's hospitals on their home page or within one click of their home page, many of them promote the research that's going on and offer research protocols as an opportunity for advanced patient care. The other advantage here with patient care is that some of you may have diagnostic tools or other tests that are available that coincide with research that you're doing that aren't typical to another hospital, particularly a community or an adult hospital, that can benefit your patients, as well as differentiating factors when you think of the clinical programs. I found these specifically on a website, and I thought they wrapped it up pretty well, is that often when you have research going on, you have new cures and treatment therapies. You have the state-of-the-art technologies, as we talked about before. The other is that you have a lot of specialized surgical and medical procedures, and your physicians and surgeons tend to be at the cutting edge of their clinical field. The other thing to think about is with your physician recruitment and retention. I think most of us are aware that this is a challenge as we look out into the future for our subspecialists. The current trends are showing that not a lot of fellows are completing their training program at the rate that we see the aging work population, and so it's pretty critical to think about what you offer for recruitment. I think most people think first along the lines of compensation, and that's actually a good idea, but there are other things that people look at within their workplace. And what some studies have shown is that physicians who work in an environment where research is going on have a higher level of job satisfaction. It's also important for a lot of our new recruits that they work in a place that has a local, regional, or national reputation, and also there's something attractive about being within a research program that attracts the biggest and the brightest and the best. Finally, when we talk about research, we can think of access to alternative revenue streams. And this is also an area that's not as apparent as you might think about. When you connect with your community on research activities, you often have an opportunity to join in with some of the philanthropic thinkers. And so you can look at working with your foundation to develop research dollars. It also helps you put into place relationships with health-oriented foundations that are specific to diseases such as the American Heart Association or the Cystic Fibrosis foundation. I'm sure there are many others that you're aware of. So I think that there are opportunities here both in physician recruitment, in enhancing your reputation in the community, and also adding some new revenue streams to your facility. Now at this point we have a polling question for the audience. Ken?
Thanks, Patty. I'll ask the audience now to please take a moment to respond to the question which is coming up on your screen now. The question is, what tangible benefits have you seen from having research as part of your mission? Please respond by clicking on the responses that best apply to your organization, and those potential responses include philanthropic, financial, reputation, other, or nothing tangible. We'll provide the results in just a moment. I guess as we're waiting for our audience to respond to this question, understanding that these are relatively broad, I guess, Patty, from your comments, I would imagine that we ought to see some element of response in each of these categories, but do you have a sneak preview or a guess as to which might be the highest percent?
I would think that reputation is a very strong one. As I mentioned before, for people who watch their rankings in U.S. News and World Report or how they're rated by Child Magazine, there's always a component of research activities in those scales.
Okay. Very good, thanks. It looks like we're still getting a few votes coming in, but let's go ahead and close the poll, and I'll read the results. To the question, what tangible benefits have you seen from having research as part of your mission? The answers include philanthropic at 63%, financial 53%, reputation 89%, to your point, Patty, and other at 16%. And then, interestingly, no one in our audience voted for the nothing tangible answer. So very interesting, Patty. What do you take from this?
Well, I think what we're seeing is actually these things have some relationship to, as I look at this. The reputation, I think, is key, and given that the philanthropic link is a little bit higher than financial, I would assume that this indicates although research can add a new revenue stream, it's very difficult to have a research program that pays for itself, which is why I would think the financial advantage has gone down a little bit. However, it really does strengthen your ties with donors and members of the community, and that's why I would think the philanthropic piece is high.
Okay, thanks. And let's go ahead and move on to section 2. Patty?
On section 2, we're looking to see what what your funding sources may be. And we all know what's going on in the current funding environment, but I'll repeat a few things here, is that typically when you think of funding, you think of governmental agencies. The other big area is in the area of industry, sponsoring clinical trials. As we mentioned before, philanthropy is another source of funding. And what some of us overlook are actually the opportunities with institutional or internal funds. So what I included here is an arrow that can show what's the least competitive and the most competitive. I think obviously the government is most competitive. It's the top source people think of when they think of research, and probably the least competitive from an external standpoint is your institutional opportunities. So Ken, I'm going to show a graph here on slide number 11. And this is one that indicates how the NIH funding trends have gone. You can see that dollars, the upper line, the dollars are somewhat stable. However, if you think of inflation and the cost of actually conducting research, in 1995 dollars, we're showing that it's been decreasing. Currently, the budget proposal for 2013 is actually requesting a flat dollar amount equal to that which was actual for 2012 from the NIH, and that is around $30.8 million. So I think we have another question here for our audience, Ken.
Thanks, Patty. For our audience, our second polling question is coming up on your screen now. The question is, how has your organization reacted to the challenges in getting or maintaining current levels of government research funding? Please respond by clicking on the response that best applies to your organization. The potential responses include increased investment to keep it going, decreased interest as costs to maintain have increased, or have found other ways to finance. We'll provide the results in just a moment. It's interesting, just in looking at that graph, Patty, how stark that the difference is, I think, in the competition that we're all feeling with regard to attaining NIH research funding. It'll be interesting to see what our audience says.
Well, I think we might add that Jim might be able to also comment on this as he really looks at a research institute from the management and financial side. And I'm not sure if you want to share with us how your experience has been with NIH dollars or other government funding.
We've seen a slight decrease in NIH funding. Of course, we're concerned, like everyone else, about the fiscal cliff. I've told my staff we should probably expect a fiscal curve. I don't think we'll see an 8% across the board cut. I'm an optimist. We are increasing the bridge support that we offer to our faculty, but I think it's important, at least it's important to us, to maintain the rigor of our research program. So we expect people will continue to apply for funds.
How are the polling answers coming in, Ken?
Yep, let's go ahead and close the poll. Thank you. And so in answer to the question, how has your organization reacted to the challenges in getting or maintaining current levels of government research funding, we found that 40% answered increased investment to keep it going, 20% decreased interest as costs to maintain have increased, and then 40% have found other ways to finance. So an interesting split there, but still obviously a great degree of interest in finding financing and investment in research. Patty or Jim, any other thoughts?
I was going to comment that I think the nice thing about that poll is that people aren't discouraged from continuing and having research just because they're having to shift where the finance comes. It doesn't look like people are saying we're going to stop with our research programs based on some of our funding concerns.
It's encouraging to me because if we don't do research as pediatric research institutions, pediatric research won't be done.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Okay, Patty, do you want to move forward?
Sure. Since we had that comment that most folks are continuing to invest in research and they're finding other sources, I thought it would be nice to talk about some of those other sources. And the first one I wanted to talk about was industry. So you can see that for folks that aren't familiar with this area, industry typically focuses on devices or pharmaceutical therapies as opposed to basic research. And even within that category, the pharmaceutical trials tend to be more prominent than your device trials. So the other key thing here is imaging capabilities often is a way to validate, in some ways, particularly with devices, the effectiveness of those. So you really need to think about your organization in light of this. Do you have the patient population to think about devices or pharmaceuticals? Do you have imaging or other types of diagnostic services that could actually help with showing the results? And then I think the other thing to consider when you're working with industry is that they typically provide a lower indirect rate than your government-funded research. So while you can collect participation and bolster up your research portfolio with the industry-based trials, sometimes it's a more expensive route to take because the indirects are not as high. Another source that we talked about a little bit ago was the Philanthropy. And Philanthropy really presents its own opportunities and challenges. It really relies on the network and the reputation that your hospital has in your community. So some of the very positive things about it is as you work with your donors in your community or community leaders, it really provides some interaction that will allow for community visibility. And through community visibility, it's one of those things that tends to feed on itself. If you're out there and becoming more known, it sometimes may make it easier to actually generate more philanthropic dollars. The other things to think of, though, is that you tend to have dedicated staff to this, so there is an expense to philanthropy, and I think some of you are familiar with it through guilds, through operational efforts that you've made as well to help offset deficits for your hospitals. But it really is interesting. Some people like the idea of innovation, and they support research where they might not necessarily report an operational deficit. The other nice thing about philanthropy is that it tends to be flexible. You don't often have a donor who's requesting a line item budget. They will want to know what you are spending their dollars on and have some accountability. Typically, they like a summary of how you've used it over the past year, but they tend to be a little more flexible than your straight grant awarding organizations. And the other, as I said, is it could be instrumental in developing a pool of revenue for internally awarded research support, which is often important. And that leads into a bullet on internal funding. As I mentioned before, philanthropy can be done to create an internal funding pool. Another area that people can look at is reinvesting some of their clinical margin to help develop internal awards. And these internal awards can be fairly simple, but they also generate and stimulate creative thinking among your physicians, which leads back to some of the things we just talked about in recruitment, which is job satisfaction and working at a place where you're attracting a lot of the best and the brightest. If we look at slide number 14, I've talked again here about foundations, and once again looking at the internal awards. Your foundations, as we mentioned before, in alternative sources of funding, these often will provide dollars that are what you might need for seed funding. If someone has an idea, wants to do a small study, wants to determine whether or not they can participate in a larger industry research, sometimes it's nice to have a small sum of money that can help hire staff to support that activity or offset some of a physician's time. And the foundations also are connected with donors in your community, and once again, that's another way to look for folks who might be interested specifically in your organization. Now, the other, we touched on internal awards before, and I wanted to bring this up again, is that it really allows you to recognize and reward specific interests for your institution and for your physicians. And once again, it often relies on your clinical margin for funding. So in summary here, I'd just like to reiterate some of the points we made about the funding environment, and really that right now an effective research program requires a multi-funding approach. There are research funding sources available, but you need to understand those sources and particularly how you can participate in those. As we mentioned before, some of the industry studies have to do with what kind of a patient population you might have access to, what sort of diagnostic tools you have available. Another point is that research requires a long-term planning strategy to ensure the viability of the program. And I mention this because as you look at multifaceted funding sources, you need to think long-term about how you'll raise that money, who you'll be investing your dollars in to continue a program or to identify opportunities that will continue into the future. And then I think the other thing that's important is you really do have an opportunity to find funds for all levels of research. As I said, some folks, I can think of an example where they wanted some research funding because they wanted to have an opportunity to spend time speaking with similar providers in other parts of the country on disease-specific issues they were seeing with their patients. And they really didn't need a lot. They had to cover their phone calls. They had to cover some query information and a staff person to set these up. But it was pretty rewarding to them, and it was a nice way to get people thinking again about how you collect information and sort your data. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Jim, who is going to talk about how to maximize your research potential, if any of this has stimulated your thinking along those lines.
Thanks, Patty. My approach to this section is to share with you some of the lessons learned in building a research program at the Seattle Children's Research Institute. To give you some perspective, when I joined Seattle Children's 9 years ago, we had 40 employees in the research department at the time, about 20,000 square feet of research space, and about $6 million in external funding. And today, we have 330,000 square feet of research space. We have a workforce of over 1,000, and we have about $70 million in external funding. And we've learned some lessons along the way. There's different approaches that you can take, but I thought I'd share with you what I've learned. So if you turn to slide 17, most of the research that's conducted at children's hospitals is translational. The definition of translational research at a pediatric research institution in its simplest form is patient-oriented research. How do we improve the health of children? Translational research can take place in a traditional laboratory. We say it happens at the bench. It can take place in a clinic or in a hospital bed. We say it happens at the bedside. And it may also take place in the community. And it's important that there's a link between bench and bedside and community, and that there's a feedback loop from both the bedside and the community to the bench. Now, that doesn't mean that every research program has to have bench research, clinical research, and health services outcomes research. In fact, as you're thinking about maximizing your research potential, you should think about where to make strategic investments in these areas of research. And so let's consider for a moment on slide 18 the type of investment that goes along with these three broad areas of research. Clearly, there is a huge capital investment if you're going to build laboratory space. A much greater investment than would be required if you're going to do health services outcomes research, which is an office-based research program. From a seed investment perspective, and by seed investment I refer to how much would you typically provide a faculty recruit in the context of a recruitment. It's a lot more costly to recruit a bench researcher who has great capital equipment needs than it is to recruit somebody who's doing health services or outcomes research. And if you're doing clinical research and you need clinical research associates or research nurses, that may or may not be expensive. From an ROI realization time, in terms of discovery, it takes a long time for a discovery that's found in the laboratory to make its way to practice. Much shorter for health services outcomes research, community-based research. So if you move to slide 19, there is no special formula, but I thought I'd show you the distribution of expenditures by business line for Seattle Children's Research Institute between bench, clinical, and outcomes. And these are expenditures on grants awarded from external organizations. And you can see if you look at the distribution between bench and clinical outcomes and you put them together, we have close to a portfolio that's about half of each. In your own program, you may decide I'm going to invest exclusively in health services outcomes research. And that's where your investment is. Your portfolio would look different than this, or you might just invest in clinical research. I encourage you, however, if you're focused on just one of these areas, like just clinical or just health services, and avoid bench research because of the cost, that you develop collaborations so that you're able to maintain that continuum that's really required, the feedback loops between those various types of researchers. Moving on to slide number 20, I thought it would be important to give you a little bit greater insight into how we've chosen to manage recruitment. As I described, we've grown fairly rapidly, and that growth is a direct result of our success in recruiting researchers. Now, I should say, because we're a research institute, we're very focused in our recruitment efforts at stellar researchers. That doesn't mean that we're not interested in clinician researchers. In fact, 90% of our research staff are physicians who see patients in clinics. But we absolutely require that researchers come to us with funding. So a minimum of 1.5 R01 equivalents, or about $375,000 in modified total direct costs, that can move to Seattle Children's Research Institute is required. And that's been our approach since the very beginning. We've probably recruited 25 faculty over the course of the last 5 years. Now, of course, in the recruitment process, you have to consider how much seed dollars must I provide to the faculty member, and how do I provide those dollars? And I've been in this business for a long time, and it used to be that I put a lot of effort into defining exactly what was included in the seed package. 1 FTE of this, 1 FTE of that, this piece of capital equipment, that piece of capital equipment. And I've come to realize that it's much easier to approach recruitment with, I'm going to give you X number of dollars, and you decide how those dollars are spent, and don't trouble me with, oh, that piece of equipment is more expensive than I initially thought at the stage of recruitment, or, oh, my postdoc lost his funding, would you please fund him? None of those discussions take place any longer. The amount of seed dollars that's required varies by which business line you're focused on. So if you're out to recruit a bench researcher, our average investment is about $1.5 million in seed dollars. So that's $1.5 million, we get 1.5 R01s. If we're after a clinical researcher, on average we spend about $1 million in seed. If we're after a health services or outcomes researcher, it's about $750,000. Now, these seed funds cover everything. They cover unfunded salary. We don't provide salary effort in addition to. This covers everything. Unfunded salary, any recruits, any supplies, and so on. The other thing that I've learned is it is unwise to make specific time commitments around seed. You have to think like an investigator. Most investigators live off of funds that come from some extramural agency, NIH or a foundation, and they come for a specific period of time. So let's say 5 years. An investigator quickly calculates, I'm going to spend these dollars out in 5 years. And the approach is the same if you put a time limitation on seed funding. They'll divide the total funding by however many years you provided, and it will be spent out to the last dollar. I rarely return money to the NIH. So the challenge that you have then is in thinking about return on investment, if you're dividing the seed dollars out over a period of time, a short period of time in particular, you're not going to get a big return on investment. We put no time limitation on our seed dollars whatsoever. The average expenditure to seed in our institution is $70,000 a year. We have faculty who have left post-recruitment. They leave a big nest egg behind, which we can use to recruit their replacement. If you're only spending $70,000 a year and you require a minimum of 1.5 R01s in order to relocate here, then the average annual indirect revenue from that faculty member is $188,000, and it's very easy to make an argument that there's a positive return on investment for a faculty recruit. In fact, when the economy tipped over a couple of years ago and we were going through contingency planning in our hospital, cutting back in many areas, I argued with the board that, in fact, we should be out recruiting. This is an opportune time to recruit because I have a positive return on investment with all of the recruits. I would also argue with the fiscal cliff before us, it's a great time to go out and recruit because people are nervous. And if you've got the dollars and are willing to make the investment, there's real opportunity out there. Let's turn our attention to slide 21 then, and talk for a moment about managing grantor mix. Patty touched on this issue. This is really very important if you're going to maximize your research potential. What I've shown you in the table on the left is for the different award types what the average F&A or overhead recovery is for Seattle Children's Research Institute. Obviously, there's nothing on gifts, and we don't apply an overhead rate to our gifts. We feel it's easier not to have that conversation with our donors. If you consider not-for-profits outside, the average we're seeing is a little over 10% compared to our federal average of 55%. So the issue here is no different than the issue that your hospital faces around payer mix, and that is, how do we ensure that we have the appropriate grantor mix? Absolutely critical. Interestingly enough, the best payer is the federal government in the research arena, and so if you look at our grantor mix, you'll see that by far we have federal dollars over dollars from not-for-profits and corporations. We manage grantor mix by providing indirect waivers to our research centers, which are like departments within the Research Institute, and say to the centers, you can only give out so many waiver dollars because we require our maximum negotiated indirect cost rate on everything. You can give out only so many dollars, and so you should focus your investment centers on those not-for-profit grants that are going to turn into a federal grant. And I'm happy to answer additional questions if people want me to do so in the question and answer section. I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask Ken to launch our next audience poll. Ken?
Thanks, Jim. Very interesting stuff. We appreciate you sharing your experiences and profile at Seattle Children's RI. Our third polling question then is coming up on your screen now. The question is, in general, what is the sentiment around research funding in relation to administrative costs? Please respond by clicking on the response that best applies to your organization. And those potential responses include: 1, research funding generally covers costs. 2, we have been able to contain costs, so it's not an issue. Or 3, we are working to contain costs. Or 4, we continue to invest. And we'll provide the results in just a moment. It looks like we've gotten actually quite a lot of responses already, but maybe we'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds to give folks who haven't voted the last opportunity to participate. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. And again, in answer to the question, in general, what's the sentiment around research funding in relation to administrative costs? 9% of you chose that research funding generally covers costs. 9% that we have been able to contain costs, so it's not an issue. 45% we are working to contain costs, and 36% we continue to invest. Jim, I'd love to get your take on these results.
Well, I agree entirely that we need to work to contain costs. In fact, it's a great segue to my next section, because the burning platform for continuing to invest in pediatric research, particularly in the current funding environment, is to reduce the administrative burden associated with research. I'd really like to have a conversation with those folks who feel like they're generally covering their costs, because I've not been able to achieve that yet. So I'd be interested in hearing more about how people do that.
Great, thanks. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next section then. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, so what I'd like to talk about now is something completely different than what you might find interesting. Looking at slide 22, the conversation is going to involve a discussion of how we employ Toyota lean practices within our research institute. I think it's not unusual within the healthcare community to talk about how can we use tools like Lean to reduce the cost of healthcare. But I would say that most healthcare organizations that are employing Lean, who have research programs, they've resisted bringing Lean to the research program. We have used Lean practices at Seattle Children's for over 10 years. We call it continuous performance improvement, and so we have a continuous performance improvement management system. We've rolled out CPI in our research institute focused on research support services, those departments that support from an administrative perspective all the great work that's happening in our programmatic areas or in the scientific areas. The focus of any Lean program is on customer, and I want to take a little bit of a sidebar here to talk about who is the customer. Now, if you ask a faculty member who is the customer, and I was a faculty member, and I would have told you I am the customer. And so this, in fact, is the single biggest challenge that anyone who's doing Lean has to overcome. Certainly it's true on the hospital side. At the Research Institute, we say our customer is patients and families. People react to that. Well, how can your customer be the patient and family if you never see your customer? And the answer is you don't have to see your customer. The person that builds your Toyota Prius never sees you. However, if you consider what your mission is and what our mission is, they're all the same. It's to improve child health. It's clear who the customer is. And so our focus and our engagement of our staff and research support is around customer. We make data-driven decisions. I would argue that Lean uses the scientific method. It's quite appropriate for a research environment. It uses a continuous plan, do, check, act cycle, which means you constantly change. So if you don't like change, then it's a very difficult system. The focus is on waste elimination, and I always tell my staff that waste is cleverly disguised as real work, particularly in an office environment, because you hide things in email and electronic formats, and so it's hard to identify the waste. We encourage our staff to do so, and we refuse to have any conversations about how improving efficiency might impact staff FTE. We have a no layoff policy in research support services because our focus is on eliminating waste, improving value in services. We use one-piece flow within research support services, and you'll see what that means in just a moment. We've created essentially assembly lines in sponsor projects in our institutional review board throughout the entire program. On slide 23, what you'll see is the work environment that we are currently in. We moved from an office-based environment based solely on our investment in Lean into this big open environment. And I moved out of my office and sit at a workstation. You see some workstations there. They're all the same size. They all look the same. You see me standing and talking to one of my staff in the Office of Institutional Assurances. A visual workplace is especially important because it provides you the opportunity as a manager to recognize when there are issues within the office so that the issues don't go into a pending file, which causes huge delays. If there's delays in your IRB, I guarantee it's because of some problem that people don't want to deal with. Or if there's delays in executing a contract or a clinical trial agreement or whatever, it's typically around a problem. We tell folks in our visual workspace, bring problems immediately to our attention. And we no longer have one-on-one meetings. We encourage people to walk to the workstation at the time you need it, question answered, and get the question answered. In slide number 24, you see our effort focused on work in process. As I said, this is a very quantitative technique, and so here you see somebody in our institutional animal care and use committee pointing to the amount of work that they have in process, and you see visibility boards or whiteboards throughout the Research Institute. So I can tell you today, having walked by all of these visibility boards, I have 65 pieces of work in my institutional review board. I have 45 pieces of work in my institutional animal care and use committee. Sponsored research received 20 emails today containing multiple different types of transactions, which will all be on our lines tomorrow. I have a pulse on the work. I also know the names of all the staff that report to people who report to me, which is really encouraging because it creates teamwork. As you can see in slide 25, the typical environment, and this was true for us before we entered this lean revolution, is there's some transaction that comes in the office and then something happens and the transaction is completed. And our typical approach as managers is to say, let's look at a quarterly report and see what the turnaround time is, or let's look at the quarterly report and judge the metric. In Lean, there's no such thing as summary data after the fact. In Lean, you look at what's happening today, and you address issues that are happening today. And so you modify and create what I call IntelliLines in your departments to create one-piece flow of work. And you see for our institutional review board an IntelliLine on page 26. Now, I call it IntelliLine because when you first introduce the subject of Lean, and perhaps even some of you are reacting to, wait a minute, what's good to build cars is not good to build an IRB approval. What's good to build cars isn't going to work for submitting a grant or a contract. And I would argue, yes, it can, because it doesn't remove the intelligence factor from the process. It only makes the process visible. So all pieces of work come into one place. It used to be in our institutional review board, every analyst had work, and that work was provided directly from the investigators because they like the analyst or they know the analyst or whatever the case may be, and it was hidden in their email boxes. When we first made the line transformation, we flushed out all the work, and there were 380 transactions that we hadn't done. The staff couldn't believe it. Well, they were hidden. That's no longer the case. We've created a system where there's a piece of paper for every piece of work that comes in at the front end. It goes through a pre-assembly check where there's a staff member that says, is every box filled out? They don't read what's in the box. Something has to be there. Then goes to what's called our main line. An analyst rotates to the main line, and that analyst says, can I process this work in 30 minutes? If I can't, I'll do it right now. And so we went from a program that had an average turnaround time in our IRB, all transactions, full IRBs, expedited IRBs, amendments, and so on. We went from a program that had an average turnaround time of 45 days to our current state, which is an average turnaround of 10 days. And part of doing that is taking all of that work that can be done quickly and pulling it out and taking all of the other work and moving it to another line, which is called the analyst line, and we're working hard to create standard work on that line. You see here a picture box that shows not only the work in process along the entire assembly line, but in all of those phases. That's the board that I walked by today. If any analyst at any point during the day runs into a problem, PI is refusing to respond to a request for information, a PI is angry about something, a clinical research associate is not providing information, whatever the case, they turn on the andon, and an andon is a warning light. It says, I need help. We have what are called troubleshooting huddles, and a troubleshooting huddle occurs as soon as the andon goes on. I go to the huddle, the director goes to the huddle, our vice president for research goes to the huddle. We all hear what the problem is, and we create a plan to resolve the problem. So things don't fester. Things get done immediately, and that's part of the reason that we've been so successful in reducing turnaround time. I could tell you the same story if we had all day, because I'm very passionate about this, for all of the lines in research support services. We do this in facilities, building and engineering, in our animal facility, in sponsored research, in research finance, in research HR. Every area does this. So if you go to the final slide, which is slide 27, I'm giving you some sense of what is the financial impact on all of this? Because if there is no payout at the end of the day, then all of this work is for naught. And you always strive to get a little bit improvement and then a little bit more and a little bit more. And I'm showing you data that that relates to what we call our cost containment ratio, which is basically what does it cost to do research administration that isn't covered through indirect cost recovery. So it's the investment that must be required above and beyond what indirect costs provide. That investment, as Patty said, may come from the clinical margin, it may come from philanthropy, whatever the case, divided by modified total direct costs. And to give you some sense, we started our fiscal year 12 budget, our fiscal year is October 1. We started our fiscal year 12 budget at 19% for the cost containment ratio, which means essentially it takes 19 cents from the clinical or philanthropic sources after we collect all our overheads per dollar that we receive from extramural sources in order to balance the budget. And that fiscal year 12 budget was based on fiscal year 11 actual plus inflation. So we haven't sandbagged our budget to give us a good answer. And where you see is where we ended, which is at 11.6%. And basically, these programs have allowed us to take $1 million out of research administration and move them into our research programs. And so we're helping, each of our research support services staff are helping to accelerate our research programs through this investment. As you can tell, I'm passionate about it. Happy to talk more about it. And now I'd like to hand the presentation over to Diane McCarthy, who's Chief Counsel for Research Affairs from Boston Children's Hospital. Diane?
Hi, thanks very much. This has been a really interesting discussion so far, Patty and Jim. Thanks so much. Jim, that is an amazing space that you have. It wouldn't work here in Boston, I'm afraid. I wish it would. We are scattered everywhere. Our research group, our clinical trials group is in one building, our Office of Sponsored Research is in another, our admin is another, and I'm the lawyer that works mostly with them in some other site. So I would love to have a chance to look at your facility and some of the things that you're doing there. Just in follow-up to something that Patty said, we certainly have an established pediatric research program here, and the benefits that we see, I think, I mean, financial is really tough to say because of the, as you all have pointed out already, the NIH funding, but certainly reputational is a big issue for us here at Boston Children's. And then one other thing, I don't know if other folks in the audience are experiencing this, but you know, when we look at the funding for our research programs, one of the issues we're seeing with foundations, and this is going to lead me into my presentation a little bit, has to do with the new wave we've sort of seen with some of the foundations really looking to assert more control over intellectual property development based on their funding. And so we may be actually cutting back on foundation funding, and I'm just curious if other people in the audience are experiencing the same thing. So my focus is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to talk from the perspective of an established academic medical center here in Boston. We are a Harvard Medical School affiliate, and that's important for this presentation because I'm going to talk about some of the Harvard rules that affect us here and how they affect us. So that's sort of a big deal for us as it relates to startups and intellectual property and conflicts of interest. I'm going to talk about a couple of issues based on the issues of intellectual property developed in the course of our research program. So it's a little bit different than what we've been talking about. But I'm going to talk about intellectual property developed here at Children's and startups that either Children's or our faculty may be interested in beginning in order to commercialize that intellectual property. And then I'm going to talk about the related conflicts of interest or conflicts of commitment issues that we've seen arise related to these faculty startups. We've seen this more and more recently, and so I'll be curious during the discussion if other folks are also coming up with these issues. And then I'm also going to discuss a case from Mass General Hospital that is really on point and interesting when you think about the rights to ownership of intellectual property. So traditionally, we have licensed our intellectual property, as probably many of you have, to big pharma and device companies to bring to the market. But a lot of our research, as is true in most academic medical centers, is early stage, not necessarily appropriate for licensing to big pharma. They might not be so particularly interested in it from where we've gotten it. They may want it to be a little bit further developed. And so we're seeing more of an interest in startup companies based on the intellectual property that we have developed. We, as a nonprofit, certainly encourage inventions, but for the purpose of benefiting the public. So that's certainly our mission, and that's what we want to do with the intellectual property and inventions that come out of Boston Children's. We have been very involved with a lot of collaborations with private companies to develop intellectual property, and some of those move to commercialization and some of them don't. But as I said, we've really found that startups might be the most appropriate way to bring some of this to the public. And then what we found is not only do we identify in the course of looking at the intellectual property and the invention and where it is in its stage, not only are we as Children's potentially interested in a startup company, but we found that our faculty members more and more seem to be bringing this concept of a startup company to us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's played out here. And then the other thing is our faculty members are being approached more and more to provide advice to companies that may have been formed based on the inventions that they developed here at Boston Children's. And some of the issues related to that have to do with the taking of equity in return for sitting on scientific advisory boards or boards of directors or consulting. And so we're going to talk a little bit when we get into the conflicts of interest section about how taking equity relates to the conflicts and how we try to help to resolve some of those things. So let me start with just a discussion of our intellectual property policy here at Boston Children's. Probably most of you have intellectual property policies that govern the ownership of the intellectual property developed at your institution. Ours says, as probably most of yours does, that all IP developed by members of our staff, whether we pay them or not, even our volunteers and others, that are conducted here or use our facilities or materials or our resources or administered by ours, all of that IP is the property of Boston Children's Hospital. Our group, the Technology and Innovation Development Office, a group called TIDO, is solely responsible for the commercialization and distribution of inventions. So all inventions get disclosed to TIDO. TIDO is responsible for reviewing those inventions, deciding on whether or not to file patent or other protection for those inventions, and then really working with the faculty member and the inventor to try to figure out the best way to commercialize the invention if it's really early stage, as I think one of our speakers talked about earlier. We might invest some money in it ourselves. There's various funds here at Children's to do that, to get it to a little bit later stage so that it's ready for commercialization. But they are the group that really works with our investigators to decide how and when to commercialize intellectual property here at Children's. This is important because it really speaks to the need to have a very close relationship between the Office of General Counsel and my role here at Children's and the TITO office. They're the ones who really know when we're starting to talk about commercializing an invention. And so it's really important for them to talk to me at that point, get me involved, and then together we work very collaboratively with the inventor to talk about how best to commercialize the issue, the intellectual property. What are the issues in commercialization? If we're going to do a startup, what are some of the issues in startups? What does it mean if either the institution or the inventor will take equity, or if both will take equity? What kind of role can the faculty member play in the startup? Can the faculty member be on the board? Can he or she be a consultant? So we really work very closely together with our faculty at the point that TITO begins to talk about how best to commercialize an invention. And then under our IP policy, proceeds from the commercialization of our intellectual property are distributed to the inventor, a portion to the inventor, a portion to the inventor's department, a portion to the inventor's lab, and then some back to Boston Children's Hospital to get reinvested in the research enterprise. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Ken, and we're going to conduct our fourth audience poll. Ken?
Yes, thanks, Diane. I appreciate that. We ask the audience to please take a moment to respond to the polling question, which is coming up on your screen now. And the question is, has your organization realized financial benefit from IP? Please respond by clicking on either the yes or no option, and we'll provide the results in a minute or so here as we allow folks to respond. Maybe during that time, Diane, I'll ask you a related question, which I guess isn't necessarily intended to predict what the results of this poll would be, but in your experience, or do you have a sense for whether Boston Children's policies and approach is typical or atypical compared to other peers in the children's research world?
Well, that's a great question, and it's going to lead to our next section here. I think it's pretty typical. It's certainly exactly the policies of our neighbor Harvard-affiliated institutions. But I talk a lot to other academic centers across the country, and they have very, very similar policies.
Okay, thanks. And it looks like I'm waiting a couple extra seconds here, but let's go ahead and close the poll. And so in answer to the question, has your organization realized financial benefit from IP, 42% responded yes, 58% responded no. So obviously we're subject to those listening to the webinar today. But Diane, any reaction to these results?
Well, I am hopeful that what I have to say here will be of interest to the 58% who aren't realizing any financial benefit from their intellectual property. I think that, you know, it's tough, to be honest with you, because if you're with an academic medical center, the research is often so early stage that it is hard to commercialize it. And so that is why we do give our faculty a lot of extra support. We've got various funding mechanisms to get some of the research to a later stage. And that may be a little bit of what we're seeing in this poll.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the rest of Section 4.
So this is a really interesting case that focuses on the ownership of intellectual property. And this is one of our Boston neighbors, another sorry, I think this is slide 32. So on slide 32, we would see that in July 18th of 2012, so it's a very recent case that was decided here in Massachusetts in the Superior Court. And as I said, it involves a neighbor institution, Mass General Hospital. They're also a Harvard-affiliated hospital. And it's exactly on point to some of the question about ownership of intellectual property. A physician there who's a member of the staff, who's a surgeon at Mass General and a faculty member at Harvard, created several inventions from 2004 to 2008 in his practice at Mass General and assigned those rights to the inventions to Mass General, who then, as I understand it from reading the case, and only from reading the case, I don't have any other knowledge of the case, Mass General then reassigned the rights back to Dr. Brosella, who formed a company to market some of his inventions. But in January of 2012, he created something called a voice box invention that he conceived in his basement on his own time and at his own expense, but incorporated knowledge acquired in the course of his professional activities at Mass General. So under Mass General's IP policy, this gets to the question that you asked a couple minutes ago, Mass General owns all staff inventions that arise out of or relate to the clinical research, educational, or other activities of the inventor. And as is true here at Children's, in order to be on our faculty, you have to agree to our policies, and this is just one of those policies. So in order to be on the faculty at Mass General, the physician needed to agree to abide by the policy. So the issue before the court was, is the Mass General policy, as applied to this physician, unfair and unreasonable restraint on trade and ordinary competition? And the court found that the voice box arose out of his activities at MGH, and per the policy, he's obligated to assign the rights to the invention to MGH. The court went on to find that nothing in the policy prohibited him from practicing medicine elsewhere, that as a member of the staff, he benefited from the clinical resources, office space, doctor-patient relationships, professional prestige of teaching, of being at a major teaching hospital and Harvard-affiliated hospital. And in return, he agreed to contribute to MGH research and educational objectives, and that MGH has a legitimate interest in freely sharing staff inventions to further research and benefit its patients, which outweighed any possible restraint on trade. So this is an important case, I think, because he didn't invent this at Mass General. He didn't invent it in the lab at Mass General. He invented it at home. And yet, because it incorporated the knowledge that he acquired in the course of his professional activities at MGH, the court found that indeed MGH owned it, and he had an obligation to assign it to MGH. So I think this supports all of our academic IP policies and is an important case for us. So we've talked a little bit about intellectual property, who owns the intellectual property, who's responsible for commercializing intellectual property. And then let's switch our focus a little bit to the question of conflicts of interest when the decision is made to commercialize an invention through a startup. So we've discovered that there are conflicts of interest for both the institution and the faculty member when we start to think about taking equity in startup companies or forming our own startup companies. And so we've really been focusing a lot on this lately. A conflict of interest arises when a faculty or staff member has an existing or potential financial or other interest that impairs or might reasonably appear to impair that faculty member's independence of judgment. Or he might receive personally a financial or other benefit from the use or disclosure of university information, including intellectual property that's been developed here. So the HMS rules, the Harvard Medical School rules that apply to all of our faculty, provide a faculty member from engaging in research when that faculty member is either paid a certain amount of money or has a certain ownership interest in an entity sponsoring the research. It also says that the faculty member can't hold an executive position in a for-profit business in which he has equity. It requires annual disclosures of conflicts, and it requires a management plan to address potential conflicts of interest. So the issue here, as I mentioned earlier, that we've really been focusing on has to do with the issue of holding equity. Because startups want to ensure the involvement of the inventor, they often want to offer the inventor, and the inventor wants to accept equity in the company. And so the issue that's raised is how independent can the inventor continue to be in his responsibilities, academic responsibilities here at Children's, if he has a financial incentive in the company and the marketing of the device or invention or whatever it might be. And then the other issue that we're focusing on and comes into play here has to do with conflicts of commitment, different than conflicts of interest. Conflicts of commitment, we come up in consulting agreements, SABs, founding companies. We're really looking at the faculty member really spending a lot more time in these companies rather than here focusing on their academic responsibilities. So we really want to help our faculty members deal with potential conflicts of commitment and ensure that the amount of time they spend on outside activities don't compromise or interfere with their responsibilities to children and to their academic work. So you can imagine that these are actually very difficult and sensitive issues. The faculty member has a lot invested in the invention and the intellectual property, is often very committed to the startup company, very committed to ensuring that the invention, the startup company works efficiently and does the best it can to get the invention to market. So we really try to support our faculty members in a couple of ways. One way that we do this is we review all consulting agreements, and we require that the consulting agreement contains some standard terms that protect the ownership of children's intellectual property. And then we found that a research conflict of interest committee that is comprised of our senior faculty members has been extremely helpful in advising our faculty on conflict of interest issues. It provides a forum for discussion of faculty issues. It fosters the awareness of what conflicts are and how to avoid conflicts or how to manage conflicts. It works with me in reviewing matters that present potential conflicts. It approves management plans that I've worked on. And as I said, we've found increasingly that it really has started to deal a lot with startups. So I think, Ken, I think we have another poll.
Yes, thanks, Diane. To the audience then, please take a moment to respond to the polling question that's coming up on your screen, and that question is, has IP within your organization contributed to new industry in the community? And please respond by clicking on either yes or no, and we'll provide the results in just a minute. We'll probably only leave this poll open for a little bit shorter time, just in the interest of time, and so we can get to some of your questions. But I will maybe give people another 10 or 15 seconds, and then we'll close the poll. Okay, that's great. Go ahead and close the poll. Thanks, audience, for being quick with your responses. So in answer to the question, has IP within your organization contributed to new industry in the community, 38% said yes and 63% no. Interesting. Yeah, it can be read a number of ways. Diane, any reaction from you?
I think it's consistent with what we saw in the last poll, right?
Yeah, it does seem consistent. Well, Diane, if you want to go ahead and move on with the formal portion, wrapping up the formal portion of the presentation.
Okay, so I've just got 3 scenarios here that I'm just going to go through quickly. So if we go to slide 38, you'd see the first scenario. This is actually the best scenario of the 3. This is the one that we like to see happen. This is a scenario where a faculty member invents a new therapy or a new diagnostic or device, uses our resources. We help to fund the development of the invention, and we work with the faculty member to find investors and establish a company. The hospital licenses the invention to the outside company. The hospital may or may not take equity in it. The individual may or may not take equity in it. The company then takes a license to the IP developed here. We often receive upfront fees or milestone-based royalties. Here, the conflict that relates to children's is that we won't conduct clinical trials on an invention if we hold equity in the company because we have the same conflict issues as the inventor. The faculty member won't take an executive position in the company, but may serve as a founder, provide services on the scientific advisory board, and want to take equity. But if the faculty member takes equity, the faculty member won't conduct or supervise clinical trials on the invention, again, to protect on the COI issue. And then we put a COI management plan in place, and we talk with our faculty COI committee to help advise that faculty member, and they spend quite a bit of time with him or her talking about the issues and thinking through how the conflicts might be managed. One we don't want to see, but unfortunately we've seen more and more of, and that's where the faculty member devises the new invention here, uses our resources, and then independently, without talking to us, while Tito is out there talking about how to commercialize the invention, they disclose the invention to us, thank goodness. Tito's out there trying to think about how to commercialize the invention, and they go out and they find some investors and form their own startup company without even telling us. And then they come to us and they say, oh, oops, you know, I've got this company and I'd really like to license the intellectual property from children. So now we have a bit of a problem that we need to deal with. We try hard to avoid these issues because, of course, the invention belongs to us. The faculty member and the company don't have any rights to it. And this really undermines our intellectual property policy and our relationship with our faculty members. So it takes a lot of work to sort of get this back on track. And unfortunately, we've seen a few of those lately. And then there's just one last scenario I thought I would mention, where this is one that we don't really have an answer to. And I'm curious if other people have come across a situation like this. We're still sort of struggling with it, but this is one where the faculty member develops software for a new clinical application. And we agree, both of us together, the faculty member and children's, agree that we're going to distribute this as open source. We're not going to take any royalties to this. We're not going to license it. But then we find out, after we've distributed it as open source, the faculty members formed a startup company to sell services related to the open source material. And that sort of puzzles us. We find that, you know, the software is owned by us. We've distributed it open source. And yet the faculty members find a way to commercialize the invention. So, you know, we're struggling with, does this contradict our decision to open source it? Is it based on our IP, and therefore we are entitled to royalties and payments? And again, the big issue is it really undermines our relationship with faculty, and we really want to work hard to avoid those kinds of things. So just to conclude here, relationships with outside companies and faculty can be extremely valuable to the academic institution and to all of us, and really does benefit the public because it gets a lot of our IP to the public quicker than it would be if we tried to license it through big pharma or device. But we do have some issues that we have to deal with related to the conflicts of interest and commitments and the rights of ownership of the IP. And what we found is these issues are best dealt with if we can deal with them up front, form strong relationships with our faculty, enter into management plans that really work for everybody, and then go forward as a real team. So that concludes the formal portion of the program, and I'm going to hand it back to Ken to open the Q&A portion of the session. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. That's fascinating to hear about those examples, and it's also impressive, I think, in your presentation and clearly what your organization's focus is on in terms of maintaining that relationship between the faculty and the organization. I will comment, I guess, that brings our formal presentation to a close. I'm sure that our audience joins me in thanking our presenters for sharing their thoughts and experiences regarding pediatric research. The audience is clearly invested in the topic as evidenced by the many questions that we've received. So let's move on to some of those questions. I'll give you a reminder that you may still submit questions for our speakers. Just enter your questions in the Q&A pane, the question and answer pane on the right of your screen at any point. We will answer as many as possible in the time that we have, and I'm sure our speakers will be happy to answer questions after the presentation is over as well. So if we're not able to get to it in the formal presentation, we'll get to it following. So first question I'll ask, maybe I'll move back and forth between questions that appear to be addressed to Diane versus Dr. Hendricks. The first question I'll ask is to Dr. Hendricks. Can you please talk about research productivity indicators that you are currently measuring? So I'm assuming that means those specific metrics that you use in order to determine whether you're meeting your productivity targets or not.
Overall, of course, the metric is total extramural dollars generated. That's certainly the metric that our board uses to judge my performance and the performance of my team. Internally, we've developed metrics as targets for our centers around allocation of space, although I've chosen not to take the path of being the space police. And so what we say to a center, if you don't achieve the metric, and you could use dollars, MTDC per square foot or indirect cost per square foot, and we all use similar numbers. If you don't achieve the metric, you can't expand your space. So as a growing program, most of the centers are really interested in having additional space. They can't do that until they achieve that metric, which means you need so many RO1s per lab bench, or you need so many RO1s per office space allocated if it's a health services and outcomes program, and the same applies to clinical programs.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I've got another one for Diane. This is, and obviously any of our speakers, Patty, Diane, or Jim, please respond as you see fit. This question appears to be more towards Diane. We don't have a formal conflict of interest committee, and the question is, how is your conflict of interest committee established? Can you tell us more about what your committee does? What kinds of issues other than startups does the committee work on?
Sure. We started our conflict of interest committee several years ago. It is, as I said, made up of very senior faculty members who sometimes themselves actually have interests in companies or started companies, so they truly do understand the conflict of interest questions that we are looking at. and the issues that go before them. Some, they're available to offer consultation to all of our faculty. So if anybody wants to go and talk to them, they're very open and willing to do that. They often consult with them around sitting on either SAVs or other roles within industry. One thing that's come up recently that they're starting to take a look at with me has to do with content distributed on websites that aren't controlled by children, but the content was developed here. We're starting to look at whether or not that's a conflict of interest. So they look at a variety of issues that might be of interest to our faculty.
Great, thank you. I'll try to get one more question in here. It looks like we're inside of 5 minutes, but this looks like it's targeted towards Jim or perhaps Patty if you have comments based on your client experience. The question is your approach to using lean concepts a common approach among your peers? And do you see this approach increasing? And so I'm reading into this question a little bit that maybe given our focus on controlling and managing costs and efficiency, is the approach using lean concepts a trend? Is it something that's commonly used among peers?
I'll comment on that. As I've gone to different children's hospitals, it seems that a lot of hospitals focus on their clinical operations, and they're starting to figure out how to approach streamlining or more efficient operations and research as well. And I believe there's just industry-wide, there's a lot of talk about both the Lean and the Six Sigma, and it's a discipline about how to put together or to look at your operations and make them more efficient. So I don't know that I could say a lot of research organizations are trying to use those terms. I believe they are trying to use the more along the continuous process improvement that is a little bit more of a generic term is what I see. But I'll let Jim comment as to how he experiences that.
I have seen papers that describe specific point improvements using lean, particularly in animal facilities. However, I'm not aware of an organization taking that big bite that we have, which is all of research support. We have been visited by other research organizations who are interested in thinking about this. I think the challenge is you cannot be successful in creating a lean organization if that only happens in one department. There has to be buy-in from leadership. So our CEO and our board are committed to lean, and there are lean targets for all of the executives here. So it makes it intercalates lean into the DNA of our organization, and that's what makes it successful here.
Great, thanks both of you. Well, I guess with those comments, I'd like to thank our presenters once again for sharing their expertise and insights with us, as well as everyone in the audience for setting aside 90 minutes of your day to listen. This then concludes today's webinar. Please take a moment to complete the electronic survey upon exiting today's session. We are beginning to formulate the content for 2013 and hope you will join us for other upcoming programs in the Pediatric Business and Healthcare Delivery series. If any of you should have any further questions about this session or the series, the subject matter in general, please feel free to contact us, and in particular, Patty Adams. Her contact information can be found on page 2 of the handout that you received. Thank you and have a great afternoon.